The morning sun rose over the vast expanse of the Pacific, casting shimmering light across waters that stretched farther than the eye could see. In late 1941, the United States Navy faced a crisis unlike any it had encountered in its history. Japan's aggressive expansion had swept through Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, capturing key islands, airfields, and ports with astonishing speed. Each victory seemed to tighten a noose around Allied positions, threatening supply lines, communications, and the very survival of distant colonies. Within the halls of Washington, at Pearl Harbor, and across naval outposts, officers debated, plotted, and prepared for the unimaginable. The challenge was staggering: a fleet depleted, resources stretched, and an enemy that had mastered the art of fast, overwhelming strikes. Yet, even amid uncertainty, resolve began to take shape, a determination that the U.S. Navy would not simply react. It would outthink, outmaneuver, and ultimately stop the Japanese advance. Japan's strategy was relentless and disciplined. They combined carrier-based air power with amphibious assaults, striking simultaneously at multiple points across thousands of miles. Singapore fell in a matter of days. The Philippines were overwhelmed, and the Dutch East Indies succumbed to coordinated attacks that left Allied forces scrambling. From Tokyo's perspective, victory seemed inevitable. The U.S., they assumed, would respond too slowly, hampered by distance and unpreparedness. But the Navy's leadership recognized a critical truth: numbers alone would not guarantee victory. Knowledge, intelligence, and strategic positioning could counteract the numerical superiority of the Japanese. Every lost ship or downed plane carried grave consequences, yet every calculated maneuver had the potential to shift momentum in ways the enemy had not anticipated. At the center of the Navy's strategy was Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Calm, measured, and exceptionally analytical, Nimitz understood the theater of war better than almost anyone. He knew that while Japan could strike with astonishing speed, its forces were overextended across a Pacific so vast it would eventually strain supply lines, morale, and operational cohesion. Nimitz's vision required patience, foresight, and precision, an understanding that even in the face of overwhelming power, the U.S. could leverage intelligence and adaptability to fight on favorable terms. Every fleet deployment, every training exercise, every logistical operation became part of a larger plan to confront Japan not only with firepower, but with strategy, cunning, and insight. Intelligence played a pivotal role in this emerging approach. Codebreakers at Pearl Harbor and other Allied stations tirelessly decrypted Japanese communications, revealing not only operational movements, but overarching intentions. These revelations transformed uncertainty into opportunity. The Navy could anticipate attacks, preposition carriers, and strike with unprecedented coordination. When Japanese plans for assaults in the Coral Sea were intercepted, U.S. forces prepared an ambush that would halt Japan's momentum for the first time. The battle demonstrated that mastery of information could rival mastery of firepower. For the first time, the vast Pacific was not merely a barrier. It became a chessboard on which knowledge, prediction, and strategy dictated action. Human endurance under extreme pressure became the second pillar of success. Sailors endured long, grueling hours aboard cramped ships, with the constant hum of engines, the threat of torpedoes, and the tension of sudden air attacks ever present. Pilots spent hours at sea searching for enemy vessels, often returning battle-worn but alive, their experiences shaping new tactics. Every man became a critical link in a vast operational network, where courage, training, and quick decision-making determined survival. The Navy's strategy relied not just on abstract plans, but on the grit and skill of these individuals, whose dedication transformed theory into action and helped preserve the fragile balance of power across thousands of miles of ocean. Logistics emerged as both challenge and opportunity. Supplying ships, aircraft, and personnel across the Pacific's immense distances demanded innovation. Refueling at sea, constructing forward bases, and streamlining supply lines became daily imperatives. Each success in sustaining forces allowed the Navy to strike farther, respond faster, and maintain a presence that kept Japanese planners constantly guessing. The operational flexibility created by this logistics network enabled bold strategies that would have been impossible without meticulous planning. Every barrel of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every ration delivered contributed not just to operational capability, but to the larger psychological war that unfolded across the Pacific. The first real test of these ideas came with the Battle of the Coral Sea. For the first time in history, two fleets fought without ever coming into direct contact. The conflict was fought entirely with aircraft launched from carriers. Intelligence allowed U.S. commanders to position their forces precisely, countering Japanese plans for an assault on Port Moresby. Although the battle ended inconclusively in terms of ships sunk, the strategic outcome was clear. Japan's advance had been halted. For the first time, Allied forces struck a Japanese fleet on terms that favored foresight, coordination, and calculated risk. The engagement shattered the myth of invincibility that had surrounded Japan's early campaigns, boosting morale among Allied forces and sailors alike. This early victory laid the groundwork for a new type of naval warfare, one that combined speed, intelligence, air power, and courage into an integrated strategy. The Navy's leaders understood that the coming months would demand even greater innovation and sacrifice. The Coral Sea experience showed that with precise planning, informed anticipation, and steadfast resolve, the U.S. Navy could not only survive against Japan's formidable forces, but could begin to seize the initiative. In the vastness of the Pacific, where every mile counted, strategy became both shield and weapon, a guide that would lead the United States through its darkest hours and toward the eventual reversal of fortune that would define the war in the Pacific. As the Navy regrouped after Coral Sea, the vastness of the Pacific became both a challenge and a canvas for strategy. Intelligence continued to dominate planning, as analysts worked tirelessly to predict Japanese movements and intentions. Codebreakers revealed plans for a major assault on Midway Atoll, intended to eliminate the remaining American carriers and secure Japanese dominance of the Central Pacific. The very thought of losing Midway stirred urgency in Washington and Pearl Harbor. Every officer and sailor understood that this island was not just a tactical objective, but a linchpin that could decide the fate of the entire theater. The Navy prepared meticulously, aware that this confrontation would require not only courage and skill, but the culmination of all lessons learned from prior engagements. Admiral Nimitz took personal responsibility for orchestrating the defense. He positioned his limited carrier groups precisely to cover Midway, balancing the need for secrecy with the imperative to confront a numerically superior force. Japanese commanders, confident in their overwhelming strength, underestimated the Americans' preparedness. Yet behind the calm exterior of Nimitz and his staff was a deep tension, a recognition that even a small misstep could lead to catastrophic loss. Fleet carriers and supporting vessels were deployed with careful consideration of wind, current, and visibility, ensuring that when battle erupted, every asset could function optimally. The ocean itself became an ally to those who could read it, turning natural variables into tactical advantage. The human element was no less critical. Pilots trained relentlessly for long-range attacks over open water, often flying beyond the horizon without visual contact with their targets. Sailors on carriers maintained constant readiness, checking guns, engines, and communications systems under extreme conditions. Every individual, from radar operators to torpedo mechanics, carried a weight far beyond their immediate duties. Each task, however mundane it seemed, could alter the course of the battle. Stories of men braving intense anti-aircraft fire or diving into oil-slicked waters to rescue comrades exemplified the courage that turned strategy into action. These human experiences, often overlooked in historical analysis, were the glue that held the Navy's operational plan together under immense pressure. Midway was fought in a blur of motion and sound, as carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft into a sky filled with enemy formations. Pilots relied on maps, intelligence, and instinct, attacking Japanese carriers that had no warning of the incoming American strike. The initial attacks, though costly, inflicted crippling damage on the enemy's fleet. Within hours, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were ablaze, their decks transformed into infernos of fire and smoke. The rapid destruction of these carriers shattered Japan's offensive capability and marked a turning point in the Pacific War. The success was not merely tactical. It represented the triumph of foresight, intelligence, and disciplined execution over brute force. The psychological impact was immense. Japan, which had assumed the invincibility of its carriers and naval supremacy, faced the first real setback of the war. In Tokyo, shock and disbelief reverberated through naval command, forcing a re-evaluation of both strategy and morale. Across the Pacific, American forces and allied nations celebrated a victory that had seemed improbable just months before. Sailors and pilots returned to their ships and bases with renewed confidence, having proven that even against a superior force, careful planning, intelligence, and bravery could decisively alter the balance of power. The battle underscored the idea that momentum in war could shift quickly when strategic insight met operational precision. Midway also highlighted the critical role of technology and innovation. Radar, long-range reconnaissance, and carrier-based communications allowed American forces to detect and engage the enemy with unprecedented efficiency. Innovations in torpedo design, aircraft armaments, and damage control systems further enhanced the Navy's effectiveness. These technological advantages, when combined with intelligence and human skill, multiplied the impact of every maneuver. The lessons learned at Midway would inform every subsequent campaign, establishing standards for operational planning and inter-service coordination that became central to the Navy's long-term success. The aftermath of Midway allowed the U.S. Navy to transition from reactive defense to calculated offense. Island-hopping campaigns could now be mounted with greater security, as Japanese capacity to project power had been diminished. Every victory built upon the last, creating cumulative effects that strained Japanese supply lines, overstretched their fleet, and exposed weaknesses in their operational doctrine. Nimitz and his commanders understood that the war in the Pacific would not be decided by a single battle alone, but by a series of carefully planned operations that leveraged intelligence, logistics, and the courage of individuals across vast distances. The ability to anticipate and shape engagements had become America's greatest weapon. Even as the Navy celebrated the triumph at Midway, the war's human cost was starkly evident. Sailors and pilots had paid a heavy price, and the ocean carried the silent testimony of lives lost in service of strategy. Yet these sacrifices imbued the remaining forces with a profound sense of purpose. Each engagement validated the principle that preparation, discipline, and foresight could mitigate the randomness of combat. Midway became more than a battle. It became a symbol of resilience, strategic brilliance, and the capacity of the United States Navy to adapt, endure, and ultimately overcome a foe that had once seemed unstoppable. With Midway behind them, the U.S. Navy shifted from halting Japanese expansion to reclaiming territory and projecting power across the Pacific. The victory had bought time, but it had not ended the war. Japan still commanded significant portions of Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific, and their remaining carriers and land-based air forces posed persistent threats. The Navy now faced the challenge of transitioning from reactive defense to sustained offensive operations. Commanders understood that to protect supply lines, support Allied forces, and prepare for future invasions, they would need to maintain initiative across vast oceanic distances. Every move had to be calculated, balancing aggression with the prudence required to preserve their limited yet potent fleet. The campaign for Guadalcanal became the first true test of this new operational approach. Located strategically in the Solomon Islands, the Japanese had begun constructing an airfield that threatened Allied control of vital sea lanes. Recognizing the risk, Nimitz and his staff coordinated a combined naval, air, and marine operation to seize the island. Intelligence played a crucial role. Reconnaissance flights mapped enemy positions, revealing fortifications and troop deployments. This allowed planners to time amphibious landings with supporting carrier strikes, a synchronization that would define modern naval warfare. Every ship, plane, and landing craft had to function in concert, turning a distant, inhospitable island into a stage for decisive action. The human dimension of Guadalcanal was relentless. Marines endured grueling jungle combat, often fighting in dense foliage under sweltering heat, while facing Japanese snipers and ambushes. Sailors on the supporting fleet had to navigate treacherous waters under threat of air attack, kamikaze strikes, and submarine ambushes. Pilots flew long sorties, often returning to carriers with minimal fuel and extensive damage. Each participant, from the deck crew maintaining anti-aircraft guns to medics evacuating the wounded, operated under immense pressure. Courage and resilience became as vital as strategy and firepower, proving that even the most meticulously crafted plan could falter without human skill and endurance. Naval engagements around Guadalcanal showcased the evolution of U.S. strategy. Carrier task forces provided air cover for troop landings, while cruisers and destroyers patrolled the surrounding waters, anticipating Japanese counterattacks. Night battles in Iron Bottom Sound tested both tactics and nerve, as ships maneuvered through darkness, avoiding mines, torpedoes, and enemy fire while attempting to strike decisively. The Navy's ability to integrate intelligence, technology, and human performance proved crucial. Even when losses occurred, adaptations were immediate. New formations, revised engagement protocols, and tactical innovations allowed the fleet to absorb shocks and respond effectively. The Guadalcanal campaign also emphasized the strategic importance of logistics. Supplying troops and ships across hundreds of miles of open ocean required coordination on an unprecedented scale. Fast transport ships, replenishment at sea, and forward staging areas ensured that both men and material reached their destinations despite Japanese interdiction efforts. Without these supply chains, even the best-trained troops and most powerful ships would have been rendered ineffective. Logistics became a force multiplier, enabling sustained operations far from home bases and demonstrating that warfare in the Pacific was as much about endurance and infrastructure as it was about combat. The psychological dimension of these operations was equally important. Japanese forces, accustomed to rapid conquest, encountered a persistent, determined enemy willing to fight for every mile of territory. For American sailors, pilots, and Marines, success at Guadalcanal validated months of rigorous training, high-risk decision-making, and unyielding discipline. Victories, small and large, built morale while eroding the enemy's confidence. Each engagement reinforced the notion that Japanese assumptions of invulnerability were flawed and that coordinated, informed action could dictate the pace and outcome of the war. Technological innovation continued to shape the Navy's effectiveness. Improved radar systems enabled early detection of enemy aircraft and ships, allowing preemptive strikes and better defensive posture. Aircraft carriers became the central hub of offensive capability, with coordinated sorties and aerial reconnaissance extending the fleet's reach. Damage control techniques improved, keeping damaged vessels afloat and operational for critical missions. The fusion of technology, strategy, and human skill created a cumulative advantage that Japan struggled to counter, gradually shifting the strategic balance in favor of the Allies. By the conclusion of the Guadalcanal campaign, the U.S. Navy had demonstrated the full potential of its evolving doctrine. Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific had been constrained, and Allied forces had secured vital positions for subsequent operations. Midway and Guadalcanal together illustrated a broader truth. The combination of intelligence, logistics, technology, and human resilience could overcome even the most formidable adversary. The Navy had moved from reaction to initiative, establishing a pattern of operations that would define the remainder of the Pacific War and set the stage for the relentless island-hopping campaigns that would bring the Allies ever closer to Japan's home islands. With Guadalcanal secured, the U.S. Navy began to refine its offensive strategy across the Pacific, embracing a bold and methodical approach known as island hopping. Rather than attacking every Japanese-held island, commanders identified strategic positions that could serve as forward bases for airfields, supply depots, and staging areas. Each operation was meticulously planned to isolate Japanese garrisons, cut supply lines, and force the enemy into untenable positions. This approach minimized unnecessary losses while maximizing operational impact, demonstrating a level of strategic foresight that contrasted sharply with the initial chaos following Pearl Harbor. For the first time, the Pacific Campaign became a deliberate, coordinated effort, combining naval firepower, air superiority, and ground operations into a single, integrated offensive. The Solomons Campaign highlighted both the complexity and the stakes of this strategy. Islands such as New Georgia, Bougainville, and the Treasury Islands became focal points for coordinated assaults involving carriers, battleships, and amphibious forces. U.S. commanders learned to exploit reconnaissance, submarine activity, and code-breaking to anticipate Japanese movements. Pilots flew long-range missions, striking airfields and supply lines before ground troops landed. Destroyers patrolled narrow channels to intercept enemy reinforcements, while Marines secured beachheads under heavy fire. Each engagement was a test of coordination, timing, and resilience, forcing the Navy to constantly adapt and innovate in response to a determined and often desperate adversary. Human endurance remained at the center of these operations. Sailors spent weeks at sea, often in perilous conditions, maintaining the constant readiness of ships, guns, and communications. Marines and Army units contended with tropical disease, extreme heat, and relentless enemy fire as they advanced inland. Pilots faced anti-aircraft fire, unpredictable weather, and long missions that pushed the limits of aircraft performance. Despite exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty, these men demonstrated extraordinary courage, forging a collective resolve that made the Navy's broader strategy feasible. The human element was inseparable from tactical and strategic success. Without their dedication, even the best-laid plans could falter. Logistics continued to define the Navy's operational capability. Forward bases and captured islands were quickly transformed into fuel depots, ammunition stores, and repair facilities. Supply convoys traversed hundreds of miles, often under threat from submarines and aircraft. Ships capable of refueling others at sea extended the Navy's operational reach, allowing carriers to maintain offensive presence far from home ports. Each successful resupply enabled sustained operations, while every failure carried immediate consequences for troops and pilots alike. The ability to manage and adapt logistical networks became a decisive factor, demonstrating that the Pacific War was as much about supply and endurance as it was about combat. Technology and innovation were equally critical. Radar allowed early warning of incoming air raids, enabling defensive coordination and offensive strikes. Carrier-based aircraft extended the reach of the fleet, striking islands, shipping lanes, and enemy positions hundreds of miles away. Submarines harassed Japanese supply lines, weakening resistance before major assaults. Damage control techniques improved, keeping vessels operational even after sustaining heavy fire. Each technological advancement multiplied the impact of human skill and strategic planning, creating a cumulative advantage that Japan struggled to match as the Allies pressed deeper into the Pacific. The Navy's integrated strategy forced the Japanese to fight on unfavorable terms. Isolated garrisons were cut off from resupply, morale deteriorated, and commanders were increasingly forced into reactive maneuvers. While Japanese pilots and sailors fought with determination, the cumulative effect of intelligence, air superiority, and naval coordination eroded their ability to sustain offensive operations. Battles became smaller in scale but higher in consequence, with the Navy leveraging every advantage to dictate the pace of engagements. The strategic initiative had shifted. The Japanese could no longer advance at will, and the Allies increasingly determined where, when, and how confrontations would occur. Island hopping also had profound psychological effects. American forces, emboldened by each successive victory, gained confidence in their ability to challenge the previously invincible Japanese fleet. Conversely, Japanese commanders faced repeated setbacks that forced them to stretch resources thin across the Pacific, undermining morale and creating uncertainty in decision-making. Every captured island, every destroyed airfield, every disrupted supply line reinforced the growing perception that Japan's momentum had been broken. The Navy's strategic patience, combined with tactical innovation, had turned what had once seemed a defensive struggle into an organized, escalating counteroffensive. By the end of this phase of the campaign, the U.S. Navy had established both operational mastery and strategic momentum. Midway had halted Japan's advance. Guadalcanal had tested endurance and coordination, and island hopping in the Solomons had demonstrated the power of sustained, deliberate offensives. Each success laid the foundation for subsequent campaigns in the Central Pacific, setting the stage for assaults on the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, and eventually the Marianas and the Philippines. The Navy had transformed the Pacific from a theater of chaos into a controlled environment where initiative, intelligence, and coordinated action dictated outcomes, proving that strategy, preparation, and human courage could decisively shape the course of war. As the Navy pressed into the Central Pacific, the campaign shifted toward the Gilberts and Marshalls, islands that would serve as critical stepping stones toward Japan's inner defensive perimeter. Each operation was planned with precision, integrating air strikes, naval bombardments, and amphibious landings into a seamless offensive. Intelligence played a decisive role. Aerial reconnaissance mapped enemy positions, intercepted communications revealed defensive preparations, and submarine patrols disrupted Japanese supply lines. Every detail mattered, for the vast distances of the Pacific amplified both the stakes and the consequences of error. The Navy approached each objective not merely as a tactical target, but as a link in a chain that would ultimately carry the fight closer to Japan itself. The human element remained central to success. Sailors endured long voyages, constant alerts, and the ever-present threat of enemy submarines. Marines landing on fortified beaches faced relentless fire, treacherous terrain, and the psychological strain of fighting in a foreign environment. Pilots flew extended sorties over uncharted waters, often navigating with minimal visual cues and relying on both skill and intuition. Every man's contribution, no matter how small, reinforced the operational plan. It was a testament to endurance, courage, and coordination, proving that strategy alone was insufficient without the unwavering commitment of those tasked to execute it under extreme conditions. Amphibious operations demanded extraordinary synchronization. Landing craft delivered troops onto coral-strewn beaches under fire, while naval bombardments softened Japanese positions and carriers provided air cover to suppress enemy aircraft. Engineers and combat support units moved rapidly to establish temporary airfields, supply depots, and communications hubs. The Navy's ability to combine these elements into a cohesive assault force reflected a maturation of doctrine forged through earlier campaigns. Lessons from Guadalcanal and the Solomons informed every movement, ensuring that mistakes were minimized and operational efficiency maximized. The campaign became a model for modern combined arms warfare, highlighting the Navy's ability to integrate disparate forces into a unified, lethal strike. Technology and innovation continued to shape the Central Pacific offensive. Radar allowed for early detection of enemy aircraft and ships, extending both defensive and offensive capabilities. Aircraft were increasingly specialized, with fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes coordinating strikes to overwhelm Japanese defenses. Submarine warfare disrupted reinforcements, while improved communications ensured that intelligence reached commanders in time to influence critical decisions. These technological advantages multiplied the impact of strategic planning and human skill, creating a cumulative effect that increasingly tilted the balance of power in favor of the United States. Japanese resistance, though fierce, was increasingly strained. Isolated garrisons were cut off from supply lines, forcing commanders to fight with dwindling resources and eroding morale. Pilots and sailors exhibited determination, but attrition and logistical difficulties undermined operational cohesion. The Navy's ability to maintain initiative, dictate the timing of engagements, and leverage combined arms made it increasingly difficult for Japan to mount effective counterattacks. Each successive victory, while costly, compounded the strategic pressure, forcing the enemy into reactive and ultimately unsustainable maneuvers. The psychological dimension of this stage was profound. American forces gained confidence in their ability to sustain operations across the vast Pacific, while Japanese forces faced repeated setbacks that eroded both morale and command effectiveness. The Navy's island-hopping strategy allowed for gradual, controlled advances, giving commanders the advantage of choosing the time, place, and method of engagement. Every captured island, every disrupted supply line, every destroyed airfield reinforced the perception that Japan's momentum had been broken. Strategic patience and calculated action proved more powerful than brute force alone. Logistics remained a defining factor in success. Establishing supply chains across thousands of miles of ocean required ingenuity, coordination, and constant vigilance. Mobile depots, forward airfields, and refueling at sea allowed the fleet to project power far beyond its home ports. Each successful resupply reinforced operational capability, while any disruption could have catastrophic consequences. The ability to sustain forces over such distances became a hallmark of the Navy's evolving strategy, demonstrating that victory in the Pacific required mastery not only of combat, but of endurance, infrastructure, and adaptation to a complex maritime environment. By the conclusion of the Gilbert's and Marshall's operations, the U.S. Navy had cemented its Central Pacific strategy. It had proven the effectiveness of intelligence-driven planning, integrated air and naval operations, and robust logistical support. The island-hopping approach had not only weakened Japanese defensive positions, but also preserved the fleet's strength for future campaigns. Each operation brought the Allies closer to Japan, setting the stage for assaults on the Marianas and the Philippines. The Navy had transformed the Pacific from a theater of Japanese dominance into a controlled battlefield where initiative, strategy, and human resilience dictated the pace and outcome of the war. The Marianas Campaign marked a critical escalation in the Pacific War as the U.S. Navy sought not merely to seize territory, but to establish bases capable of launching sustained attacks on the Japanese home islands. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam became the focal points of a strategy that combined amphibious assaults, carrier airstrikes, and relentless bombardment from battleships and cruisers. Intelligence guided every step. Aerial reconnaissance detailed Japanese fortifications, intercepted communications revealed troop dispositions, and submarine patrols disrupted reinforcements. The Navy understood that the stakes had grown exponentially. Failure here could have delayed the liberation of the Philippines and prolonged the war by months, if not years. Amphibious landings on Saipan demonstrated the Navy's operational sophistication. Waves of landing craft, heavily laden with Marines, approached coral-strewn beaches under intense artillery and machine gun fire. Carrier aircraft patrolled overhead, striking Japanese positions and providing cover against air attacks. Naval gunfire softened defenses, while engineering teams rapidly constructed makeshift supply points and airfields. Coordination between ships, aircraft, and ground forces reflected lessons learned from Guadalcanal and the Solomons, allowing the Navy to project power with precision. Yet, even with meticulous planning, the human cost was staggering, as fierce Japanese resistance and the unforgiving environment tested every man's endurance and courage. On the islands, Marines and Army units confronted fortified bunkers, hidden artillery, and fanatical defenders willing to fight to the death. The jungles and volcanic terrain compounded the difficulty, limiting mobility and exposing troops to ambushes. Medical teams worked tirelessly, evacuating the wounded while dealing with heat, disease, and exhaustion. The Navy's ability to maintain supply chains through the chaos was critical. Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements had to arrive on schedule to sustain the offensive. Human resilience proved as decisive as strategic planning, highlighting the interplay between preparation, courage, and adaptability in a campaign fought across both sea and land. Carrier-based air power was pivotal in shaping the Marianas battles. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes conducted continuous sorties, striking Japanese airfields, shipping lanes, and defensive positions. Radar systems provided early warning of incoming raids, allowing pilots to intercept attackers before they could reach the fleet or troop positions. The integration of intelligence, reconnaissance, and rapid response transformed the Navy's carriers into mobile air bases capable of projecting lethal force hundreds of miles inland. Japanese air and naval units, while formidable, struggled to counter this coordinated approach, suffering significant losses in both men and material. The campaign's logistics presented extraordinary challenges. The Marianas lay over 1,000 miles from the nearest major Allied base, requiring complex coordination of supply ships, fuel tankers, and transport vessels. Mobile repair facilities and floating depots allowed damaged ships to return to combat more quickly, while forward airfields enabled continuous sorties. Every success in sustaining the operation reinforced the Navy's ability to maintain pressure across vast distances, demonstrating that endurance, resourcefulness, and strategic foresight were as critical as combat skill. These logistical achievements underpin the Navy's ability to plan and execute increasingly ambitious operations as the war approached Japan's inner defensive perimeter. The psychological stakes were immense. American forces recognized that victory in the Marianas would provide airfields within B-29 range of Japan, making strategic bombing possible and signaling to both Japanese and Allied audiences that the initiative had irrevocably shifted. Japanese defenders, increasingly isolated and outnumbered, faced the realization that the U.S. could reach their inner defenses at will. The intensity of fighting, combined with the Navy's operational precision, eroded morale and forced Japan into reactive strategies. Each captured island served as both a tactical victory and a psychological blow, demonstrating the cumulative power of persistent, coordinated action. Naval innovation continued to play a decisive role. The use of fast carriers to support amphibious operations, combined with advanced radar, long-range reconnaissance, and precision naval gunfire, allowed the Navy to maintain initiative even against entrenched defenses. Submarines severed Japanese supply lines, further isolating garrisons and accelerating the collapse of resistance. Damage control teams kept ships operational despite heavy engagement, while aircrew adapted tactics to overcome anti-aircraft fire and unexpected weather conditions. This fusion of technology, intelligence, and human skill created a force multiplier that steadily diminished Japanese capacity to wage war in the Pacific. By the end of the Marianas Campaign, the U.S. Navy had firmly established a bridgehead for the final push toward Japan. Airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam enabled strategic bombing operations that would directly threaten the Japanese homeland. The Navy's island-hopping doctrine, refined through earlier campaigns, had proven its effectiveness, integrating intelligence, logistics, technology, and human courage into a coherent operational model. Japan's defensive perimeter had been breached, momentum had shifted decisively, and the Allies now held the initiative. The Marianas represented not only a strategic triumph, but a demonstration of how foresight, preparation, and relentless execution could break an adversary once thought unassailable. With the Marianas secured, the U.S. Navy turned its attention to the Philippines, a campaign that would strike directly at the heart of Japanese-held territory in the Pacific. Leyte Gulf became the focal point of this effort, representing both a strategic and symbolic objective. The liberation of the Philippines would sever Japan's access to vital resources in Southeast Asia and reassert American control over critical sea lanes. Intelligence again played a decisive role, as reconnaissance and intercepted communications allowed the Navy to anticipate Japanese fleet movements and coordinate an unprecedented assembly of ships, carriers, and aircraft for the coming confrontation. The stakes were immense. Failure could jeopardize the entire island-hopping strategy, but success promised to decisively cripple Japan's remaining naval power. The preparation for Leyte Gulf showcased the Navy's logistical sophistication. Troop transports, supply ships, and repair vessels were organized into massive convoys, coordinated to arrive at precisely the right time. Carriers provided constant air cover, while submarines and destroyers patrolled the surrounding waters to intercept enemy reinforcements. Each vessel, each sailor, and each pilot understood the significance of their role in a campaign that would shape the course of the Pacific War. Commanders meticulously planned every movement, knowing that even minor miscalculations could result in devastating losses across thousands of square miles of ocean. The theater had become a chessboard on a scale previously unimaginable, where intelligence, timing, and coordination were as lethal as guns and torpedoes. The human dimension of Leyte Gulf was extraordinary. Sailors manned anti-aircraft guns for hours on end, bracing against the threat of kamikaze attacks and torpedo strikes. Pilots flew long missions under extreme pressure, often returning to carriers damaged and low on fuel. Marines and Army troops faced intense opposition during landings, advancing through beaches and jungles fortified by determined Japanese defenders. Every man contributed to a larger narrative of endurance and courage. The relentless pace and immense stakes forged a unity and discipline that allowed the Navy to execute complex maneuvers across a theater larger than most battles in history. The battles themselves were immense, both in scale and consequence. Leyte Gulf involved multiple engagements across separate bodies of water, including Surigao Strait, Samar, and off Cape Engano. Carrier-based aircraft struck Japanese battleships, cruisers, and carriers with unprecedented coordination, often before enemy forces could mount an effective defense. Submarines and destroyers executed torpedo attacks that further degraded Japanese capability. The U.S. Navy's mastery of combined arms operations, linking intelligence, air power, surface vessels, and logistical support, demonstrated the culmination of years of doctrinal evolution since Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces, despite skill and determination, found themselves increasingly outmatched and outmaneuvered. Psychologically, Leyte Gulf shattered the remnants of Japanese naval morale. For centuries, Japan had prided itself on the invincibility of its fleet, yet in these few days, the Navy witnessed the near-total destruction of its remaining carriers and much of its capital ships. Commanders were forced into desperate maneuvers, sometimes sacrificing ships to protect others or retreating in confusion. Conversely, the U.S. Navy emerged emboldened, confident in its ability to operate at enormous scale across thousands of miles, while executing intricate plans with precision. The victory demonstrated that strategic initiative, combined with intelligence and human courage, could determine the outcome of even the most daunting engagements. Technology and innovation continued to prove decisive. Radar-directed anti-aircraft fire, long-range carrier reconnaissance, and coordination via advanced communications allowed U.S. forces to anticipate Japanese attacks. Carrier air wings executed simultaneous strikes from multiple directions, overwhelming enemy formations. Damage control teams kept vessels operational despite intense bombardment, while repair and replenishment operations ensured sustained pressure on Japanese positions. Each technological advantage, when integrated with strategy and human skill, amplified operational effectiveness and ensured that the initiative remained firmly in Allied hands. The Leyte Gulf campaign also underscored the importance of logistics in sustaining a complex, multi-theater offensive. Coordinated supply chains enabled the movement of troops, equipment, fuel, and ammunition across vast distances, allowing carriers and battleships to operate continuously. Forward bases and captured islands provided critical staging areas for airstrikes and amphibious operations, ensuring that the Navy could maintain momentum without pausing for extended resupply. The ability to project force far from home ports demonstrated the Navy's growing mastery of maritime warfare and its capacity to control the Pacific on both strategic and operational levels. By the conclusion of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy had been irreparably weakened. Their carrier force, once the backbone of expansion, was destroyed, leaving remaining battleships and cruisers increasingly isolated. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, had validated the island-hopping doctrine and demonstrated operational mastery across the largest naval theater in history. Leyte Gulf represented a decisive turning point, where the combination of intelligence, technology, logistics, and human courage irreversibly shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. With Japan's naval power crippled, the Allies gained the initiative, setting the stage for the final push toward Japan's home islands. Following Leyte Gulf, the U.S. Navy's attention shifted to the full liberation of the Philippines, a campaign that would strike at the heart of Japan's defensive perimeter in the Western Pacific. The strategic stakes were monumental. Regaining the Philippines would sever Japan's access to critical resources in Southeast Asia, restore vital sea lanes for Allied logistics, and provide airfields for operations closer to the Japanese homeland. Intelligence continued to drive operational planning, with reconnaissance flights mapping Japanese positions, intercepted communications revealing troop deployments, and submarine patrols cutting off reinforcements. Every ship, plane, and sailor had a role in a massive, integrated operation where precision and coordination would determine success or failure. Amphibious landings on Leyte and subsequent islands tested both skill and endurance. Landing craft delivered Marines and Army troops to heavily fortified beaches under relentless Japanese fire. Carrier-based aircraft provided close air support, while naval gunfire softened enemy positions, and engineering teams quickly established supply points, field hospitals, and temporary airstrips. Coordination between the sea, air, and ground components had evolved into a finely tuned system, allowing forces to operate over enormous distances while maintaining effectiveness. Yet, the human toll was immense. Exhaustion, disease, and the intensity of combat tested the limits of every individual involved. Pilots faced grueling missions across hostile territory. Long-range sorties targeted airfields, artillery positions, and supply depots, often encountering fierce anti-aircraft fire. Carrier crews maintained a continuous launch and recovery cycle, keeping aircraft operational while managing fatigue and damage control. Sailors braved kamikaze attacks, torpedoes, and the ever-present threat of mines, their vigilance never wavering. The interplay between human endurance, skill, and courage allowed the Navy to execute operations of unprecedented scale, demonstrating that strategy alone could not achieve victory without the relentless commitment of those tasked to carry it out. Naval innovation continued to shape the campaign's success. Radar allowed early warning of incoming air attacks, while improved communications enabled real-time coordination between carriers, cruisers, and troop transports. Aircraft carriers projected power hundreds of miles inland, striking Japanese positions before ground troops engaged, while battleships and cruisers delivered concentrated firepower with devastating effect. Submarines intercepted reinforcements and disrupted supply lines, amplifying the impact of frontline assaults. These technological advantages, integrated with meticulous planning and disciplined execution, ensured that the U.S. Navy maintained initiative at every stage of the campaign. The Japanese defense, though determined, was increasingly fractured. Isolated garrisons struggled with dwindling supplies and eroding morale, while remaining aircraft and ships were unable to mount effective counterattacks. The relentless pace of U.S. operations, combined with superior coordination and intelligence, forced Japanese commanders into reactive positions, often sacrificing territory or personnel to protect critical assets. The cumulative effect was a steady erosion of Japan's defensive capability, demonstrating that sustained pressure, when combined with strategic foresight and operational excellence, could decisively weaken an opponent over time. Logistics remained the backbone of the operation. Coordinating the delivery of troops, ammunition, fuel, and equipment across vast distances required unparalleled planning. Floating supply depots, forward airfields, and replenishment at sea allowed the Navy to maintain momentum without pause. Every successful resupply reinforced operational capability, while any disruption could have jeopardized the entire campaign. The Navy's mastery of logistics demonstrated that victory in the Pacific depended as much on endurance and infrastructure as it did on combat skill or tactical brilliance. The psychological impact of liberating the Philippines was profound. For American forces, each successful landing, airstrike, and island capture reinforced confidence in their ability to challenge Japanese forces across the Pacific. For the Japanese, repeated setbacks and the destruction of key defensive positions eroded morale and created uncertainty in command. The Navy's methodical, intelligence-driven approach made clear that Japan's momentum had been broken and that the Allies now dictated the tempo of the war. Success in the Philippines illustrated the cumulative power of strategy, coordination, and human perseverance in turning the tide of conflict. By the conclusion of the Philippine campaign, the Navy had secured a vital foothold for the final push toward Japan. Airfields established on liberated islands allowed long-range bombers to strike the Japanese homeland, while the destruction of remaining Japanese naval assets ensured Allied control of the surrounding seas. The integration of intelligence, logistics, technology, and human endurance had been perfected over years of relentless campaigning. The Navy's operations demonstrated that sustained pressure, operational precision, and strategic foresight could overcome even a determined and resourceful adversary, setting the stage for the climactic battles that would define the final phase of the Pacific War. As the U.S. Navy turned its gaze toward Japan's inner defensive ring, attention focused on Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island whose strategic importance belied its size. The island's airfields were crucial for supporting long-range bombing missions against Japan, and capturing it would provide a forward base for fighter escorts and emergency landings for B-29 bombers. Intelligence teams meticulously mapped enemy fortifications, tunnels, and artillery placements, revealing a labyrinth of defenses designed to bleed invading forces dry. For the Navy, the operation demanded flawless coordination between carriers, battleships, amphibious transports, and Marines, each element functioning as part of an integrated assault capable of overcoming Japan's prepared and desperate defenses. Amphibious landings on Iwo Jima tested every facet of naval warfare. Landing craft delivered Marines to beaches under relentless artillery and machine gun fire, while battleships and cruisers delivered suppressive fire to soften enemy positions. Carrier-based aircraft maintained constant patrols, strafing Japanese positions and intercepting reinforcements. Engineers and logistics teams worked feverishly to establish supply depots and field hospitals amidst chaos and destruction. The Navy's ability to synchronize these disparate elements reflected lessons learned from years of Pacific campaigns, where meticulous preparation, intelligence, and flexibility had become decisive factors in combat operations. The human toll on Iwo Jima was staggering. Marines fought through volcanic ash, steep ridges, and entrenched enemy positions, facing an adversary who refused surrender. Sailors on supporting vessels endured constant threat from shore batteries and kamikaze attacks, maintaining vigilance despite exhaustion and limited rest. Pilots flew multiple sorties daily, often returning with damaged aircraft, depleted fuel, and the psychological burden of witnessing comrades fall. The courage and endurance of every participant were vital to operational success, proving that strategy and planning alone could not guarantee victory without human resilience at every level. Carrier aviation played a decisive role in shaping the outcome. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes struck Japanese positions in pre-landing bombardments, disrupted reinforcements, and provided close air support for advancing Marines. Radar-directed targeting enabled precision strikes even in poor visibility, allowing the fleet to maximize its offensive potential while minimizing risk. The integration of intelligence, reconnaissance, and sustained aerial pressure created a cumulative effect, softening defenses and allowing amphibious forces to gain a foothold. Japanese defenders, though resolute, were increasingly overwhelmed by the combined firepower and coordination of American forces. Logistical mastery remained central to the operation's success. Supplying troops, ammunition, and fuel across the vast Pacific required constant vigilance, innovative techniques, and rapid adaptation. Floating depots, forward repair facilities, and replenishment at sea ensured that carriers and warships could maintain continuous operations. Every resupply reinforced operational tempo, enabling sustained pressure on the island and ensuring that combat forces remained combat effective under extreme conditions. The Navy's logistical proficiency was a critical force multiplier, demonstrating that endurance and infrastructure were as vital as strategy and firepower in the Pacific theater. The psychological stakes on Iwo Jima were profound. For American forces, each captured position and destroyed fortification validated months of preparation, intelligence gathering, and relentless campaigning. For the Japanese, the island became a symbol of desperation, with defenders fighting not just for territory, but for the defense of homeland honor. The intensity of combat, combined with operational precision and overwhelming firepower, eroded enemy morale and forced incremental concessions. Success on Iwo Jima reinforced the strategic truth that careful planning, intelligence, and sustained pressure could break even the most resolute defenses. Technological innovation continued to shape outcomes. Radar, improved communications, specialized landing craft, and precision naval gunfire enabled the Navy to conduct operations of unprecedented scale and complexity. Damage control teams kept ships operational despite heavy enemy fire, while aircrew adapted tactics to account for terrain, weather, and enemy resistance. Each innovation, when combined with rigorous planning and human endurance, amplified operational effectiveness and ensured that the Navy maintained the initiative at every stage. Japan's defenders, despite ingenuity and determination, were unable to match the integration of American strategy, technology, and sheer operational capacity. By the conclusion of the Iwo Jima campaign, the Navy had secured a vital platform for subsequent operations against Japan. The integration of intelligence, logistics, air power, and amphibious strategy demonstrated the full maturation of American naval doctrine. Japanese defenses had been degraded, operational initiative firmly rested with the Allies, and the stage was set for Okinawa and the final approach to Japan's home islands. Iwo Jima symbolized not just a tactical victory, but the culmination of years of strategic learning, technological innovation, and human endurance, a testament to the Navy's capacity to break Japan's advance and carry the Pacific War to its decisive conclusion. The Battle of Okinawa represented the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater and a critical step in bringing the war to Japan's doorstep. The island's strategic value was immense. Airfields captured here would allow sustained bombing campaigns, close air support, and staging areas for a potential invasion of Japan itself. Intelligence indicated that Japanese forces would fight with unparalleled determination, preparing elaborate defensive positions, kamikaze squadrons, and underground fortifications. For the U.S. Navy, Okinawa would test every lesson learned, from Midway and Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, requiring meticulous coordination, technological innovation, and the unyielding courage of thousands of sailors, pilots, and Marines. Amphibious landings on Okinawa began under heavy aerial and naval fire. Marines faced fortified beaches, mines, and intense artillery, while carrier aircraft provided air cover and pre-landing bombardment. Battleships and cruisers unleashed coordinated fire on Japanese positions, while destroyers patrolled surrounding waters to intercept reinforcements. The Navy's ability to integrate sea, air, and land operations was paramount, reflecting a fully matured doctrine of combined arms and intelligence-driven strategy. Even minor errors could be catastrophic in this vast and complex battlefield, yet precision, discipline, and relentless execution ensured the initial landings were successful despite fierce opposition. Human endurance was pushed to the limit. Sailors endured endless hours at battle stations, bracing against constant kamikaze attacks and the threat of torpedoes. Pilots flew multiple sorties daily, often under poor weather and intense anti-aircraft fire, facing exhaustion and psychological strain. Marines and Army units fought through rugged terrain, caves, and underground tunnels, contending with snipers, booby traps, and fanatical defenders. The Navy's success depended not only on strategic brilliance, but on the resilience, skill, and courage of every individual operating under extreme pressure. Kamikaze attacks highlighted the evolving threat posed by a desperate enemy. Aircraft loaded with explosives targeted carriers, battleships, and transports, aiming to inflict maximum damage and demoralize the fleet. Radar-directed early warning systems, coordinated fighter interceptions, and anti-aircraft fire reduced, but could not entirely eliminate this threat. The intensity of these attacks tested the Navy's technological capabilities and human reflexes, requiring rapid decision-making and adaptability. Despite losses, the fleet maintained operational tempo, demonstrating that preparation, innovation, and coordination could counter even the most unpredictable and determined attacks. Carrier aviation continued to dominate the battlefield. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes conducted continuous sorties, suppressing Japanese airfields, striking fortified positions, and protecting amphibious forces. Radar-directed targeting allowed precision strikes, maximizing effectiveness while conserving resources. Submarines intercepted supply convoys and isolated garrisons, further weakening enemy resistance. The integration of intelligence, technology, and operational skill created a force multiplier, allowing the Navy to sustain momentum and gradually break down Okinawa's formidable defenses. Logistics were critical to the prolonged campaign. Supplying troops, fuel, ammunition, and spare parts across vast ocean distances demanded meticulous coordination. Forward bases and floating depots ensured continuous operations, while repair teams kept damaged vessels afloat and operational. Every successful resupply enabled sustained pressure on the Japanese defenses, while failures could have catastrophic consequences. The Navy's mastery of logistics demonstrated that endurance and infrastructure were as decisive as combat prowess in achieving strategic objectives. The psychological impact of Okinawa was profound. For American forces, each captured ridge, destroyed bunker, and neutralized defensive position reinforced confidence in their ability to project power and maintain initiative. For the Japanese, repeated setbacks and the relentless assault from sea and air eroded morale and forced increasingly desperate tactics. The cumulative effect of strategic patience, operational coordination, and technological advantage made clear that Japan's capacity to resist was diminishing, even in the face of extraordinary resolve and sacrifice. By the conclusion of the Okinawa campaign, the Navy had achieved both strategic and operational mastery. The island provided a vital platform for air operations directly threatening the Japanese homeland, while the destruction of remaining Japanese naval and air assets secured Allied control of surrounding waters. The integration of intelligence, logistics, human endurance, and technological innovation had reached its peak, demonstrating the full maturation of the U.S. Navy's Pacific strategy. Okinawa was a testament to the Navy's ability to break Japan's advance and set the stage for the war's final, decisive acts. With Okinawa secured, the U.S. Navy entered a phase defined less by dramatic landings and more by relentless pressure, calculated isolation, and strategic inevitability. The Japanese Empire, once expansive and aggressive, now found itself constricted by an ever-tightening maritime noose. American fleets dominated the sea lanes, cutting Japan off from raw materials, fuel, and food. What had begun as a struggle for island footholds had become a systematic campaign to strangle an enemy nation's capacity to wage war, carried out day and night by ships, submarines, and aircraft operating with near-total freedom across the Pacific. Submarine warfare reached its most devastating effectiveness during this period. American submarines prowled the waters surrounding Japan, sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Tankers carrying oil from Southeast Asia became prime targets, and each successful attack compounded Japan's fuel crisis. Warships were forced to remain in port or operate at dangerously reduced capacity, while factories struggled to function without steady supplies. This unseen campaign beneath the waves quietly achieved what surface battles could not: the near-total collapse of Japan's maritime logistics, leaving its armed forces increasingly immobile and vulnerable. Carrier task forces, now unchallenged by a coherent Japanese Navy, shifted their focus to direct strikes against the Japanese home islands. For the first time, American sailors and pilots could see the enemy's industrial heartland from the air. Shipyards, aircraft factories, ports, and rail hubs were methodically targeted, not in isolated raids, but in sustained, coordinated operations. These strikes forced Japan to divert remaining resources toward homeland defense, weakening its ability to reinforce distant garrisons or mount meaningful counteroffensives. The Navy had transformed sea control into strategic leverage on an unprecedented scale. Technological superiority amplified every operation. Radar networks extended early warning across vast distances, allowing fleets to detect threats long before visual contact. Communications systems enabled real-time coordination between ships, submarines, and aircraft, ensuring that intelligence flowed seamlessly from reconnaissance to strike forces. Damage control techniques, refined through years of brutal experience, allowed vessels to survive hits that would once have doomed them. Each innovation reduced risk, preserved combat power, and reinforced the Navy's ability to operate continuously in hostile waters. The human experience behind this dominance remained arduous and often grim. Sailors endured long deployments with little rest, patrolling seas that were now quiet not because they were safe, but because Japan's shipping had largely vanished. Pilots flew missions against increasingly desperate defenses, aware that even a single mistake could be fatal. Submariners operated in claustrophobic conditions, facing depth charges and mechanical failure with no margin for error. Victory was no longer uncertain, but it was still being earned daily through discipline, fatigue, and the quiet courage of thousands who rarely saw the results of their efforts. Psychological warfare became an implicit element of naval strategy. The constant presence of American ships and aircraft near Japan's shores sent a clear message. The ocean, once a protective barrier, had become an avenue of attack. Japanese civilians and military planners alike confronted the reality that no region was beyond reach. The Navy's ability to sustain this pressure without decisive opposition eroded confidence within Japan's leadership, exposing the widening gap between national ambition and remaining capability. The balance of power had shifted so completely that resistance increasingly relied on hope rather than strategy. Allied coordination reached a level of sophistication unimaginable at the war's outset. The U.S. Navy worked seamlessly with Army Air Forces, Marine units, and Allied navies to maintain a unified front. Intelligence sharing, joint planning, and synchronized operations ensured that no effort was wasted and no advantage left unexploited. Each successful mission reinforced the strategic momentum, reducing Japan's options and accelerating the approach of an unavoidable conclusion. The Pacific War had become a contest of endurance that only one side could sustain. By this stage, the U.S. Navy had accomplished more than battlefield victories. It had reshaped the strategic landscape of the Pacific. Japan's advance had not merely been halted but reversed, dismantled piece by piece through superior planning, technology, and human resolve. Control of the sea allowed the Allies to dictate the tempo, location, and nature of every remaining engagement. The final outcome was no longer in doubt, only its timing, as the Navy's strategy brought the Pacific War to the brink of its decisive end. As the Pacific War entered its final phase, the U.S. Navy's dominance translated into a strategy focused on inevitability rather than conquest alone. Japan's remaining military strength was increasingly symbolic, its fleets immobilized by fuel shortages and its air power reduced to scattered, often one-way missions. American naval planners understood that the decisive factor was no longer defeating Japanese forces in open battle, but sustaining a pressure so comprehensive that resistance would collapse under its own weight. The ocean, once Japan's greatest advantage, had become an inescapable constraint that defined every remaining choice its leaders could make. Naval aviation intensified operations against the Japanese homeland, operating from carriers and newly secured island bases. Waves of aircraft struck coastal defenses, ports, and industrial centers, carefully coordinating with long-range bombers to overwhelm air defenses. These attacks were not improvised displays of power, but calculated efforts to dismantle Japan's capacity to respond. Each destroyed airfield reduced the threat to Allied ships. Each damaged port limited the movement of supplies and troops. The Navy's role in these operations underscored how control of the sea enabled control of the air, creating a seamless web of dominance that Japan could not escape. Submarines continued their relentless campaign, now operating almost with impunity. Japanese escort vessels were scarce, poorly fueled, and often technologically inferior. American submariners exploited this weakness, sinking the last remnants of Japan's merchant fleet and severing internal supply routes between the home islands. Food shortages worsened, factories slowed, and civilian morale deteriorated under the strain. These quiet, unseen victories beneath the waves compounded the visible devastation from air and naval bombardment, making recovery or sustained resistance increasingly impossible. The strain on Japanese leadership became evident as strategic options narrowed to grim extremes. Plans for a decisive homeland defense relied on mobilizing civilians, improvised weapons, and the hope of inflicting enough casualties to force negotiation. From the perspective of the U.S. Navy, these preparations reinforced a hard truth. Any direct invasion would come at an extraordinary human cost. Naval commanders weighed this reality carefully, recognizing that their control of the seas offered alternatives to immediate landings, even as the pressure for a final resolution intensified. Life aboard American ships reflected the strange duality of impending victory and ongoing danger. Sailors knew the enemy was weakened, yet kamikaze attacks and coastal defenses still posed lethal threats. Routine operations could turn deadly without warning, and vigilance never relaxed. Long months at sea fostered exhaustion, reflection, and a growing awareness of the war's magnitude. Many sensed they were witnessing the closing chapter of a conflict that had reshaped their lives and the world, even as they continued to perform their duties with disciplined focus. The Navy's logistical machine remained indispensable. Massive quantities of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flowed across the Pacific to sustain uninterrupted operations. Repair ships worked continuously, restoring damaged vessels and returning them to service with remarkable speed. This ability to absorb losses and maintain strength reinforced the strategic imbalance between the two sides. Where Japan struggled to replace even a single ship or aircraft, the United States sustained a tempo that seemed inexhaustible, turning material superiority into decisive strategic leverage. International dynamics also shaped this moment. Allied coordination ensured that pressure on Japan came from every direction, leaving no sanctuary or respite. The U.S. Navy's role as both shield and spear enabled other forces to operate securely, amplifying the overall effectiveness of the Allied campaign. Each successful operation tightened the strategic vice, reducing Japan's choices to submission or destruction. The Pacific, now firmly under Allied control, had become the arena in which Japan's fate would be sealed. By this point, the outcome of the war had become structurally unavoidable. Japan's advance had been broken not by a single battle, but by a sustained, adaptive strategy that combined intelligence, technology, logistics, and human endurance. The U.S. Navy had transformed the vastness of the Pacific into an instrument of pressure, using distance, mobility, and coordination to dictate the terms of conflict. As events moved toward their final resolution, the Navy stood as the central force shaping how the war would end and how history would remember the struggle for the Pacific. As Japan's strategic position collapsed, the U.S. Navy found itself confronting a paradox of absolute dominance paired with unresolved peril. The enemy's fleets were shattered, its supply lines severed, and its skies increasingly contested, yet the war refused to end quietly. American ships continued to face sporadic but lethal resistance from coastal batteries, mines, and the remaining kamikaze forces. Victory was no longer about overcoming strength, but about enduring desperation, an adversary willing to expend its last resources for symbolic blows that could still exact a heavy human cost. Naval blockades tightened further, transforming Japan's isolation into a condition of national paralysis. Merchant traffic dwindled to a trickle, and what remained hugged coastlines under constant threat from submarines and carrier aircraft. Harbors became traps rather than havens, vulnerable to air attack and surveillance. The Navy's control of maritime approaches ensured that Japan's remaining forces could neither maneuver nor regroup effectively. Every mile of ocean under Allied control reinforced the reality that Japan's war-making capacity had been hollowed out from the inside. Carrier operations during this period emphasized persistence over spectacle. Task forces launched repeated strikes against transportation networks, coastal defenses, and remaining naval installations, often encountering minimal aerial opposition. These missions demanded relentless discipline rather than dramatic heroics, long hours on flight decks, monotonous patrols, and the constant maintenance of aircraft pushed to their limits. The cumulative effect of these operations was devastating, steadily eroding Japan's ability to sustain even localized resistance. The Navy's strength lay not in isolated triumphs, but in its capacity to apply unbroken pressure across time and space. Beneath the surface, submarines continued their quiet dominance. With Japanese anti-submarine defenses largely ineffective, American boats operated with unprecedented freedom, intercepting the last remnants of maritime traffic. Even small coastal vessels became targets, further disrupting internal movement between Japan's islands. For submariners, the absence of major opposition did not eliminate danger. Mechanical failures, navigation hazards, and lingering defensive measures remained constant threats. Their successes rarely made headlines, yet they played a decisive role in collapsing Japan's remaining logistical coherence. Within Japan, the psychological impact of naval supremacy grew increasingly severe. Coastal populations lived under the awareness that Allied ships and aircraft could appear without warning, striking ports, factories, or transportation hubs at will. The ocean, long central to Japan's identity and security, now symbolized vulnerability rather than protection. This erosion of confidence extended into military leadership, where strategic discussions revolved less around victory and more around survival, honor, and the management of inevitable defeat. For American sailors, the final phase of the war carried a heavy emotional weight. Many had served since the early defeats of 1941 and 1942, witnessing the transformation of a beleaguered fleet into an unstoppable force. The prospect of an invasion of Japan loomed ominously, with estimates of casualties that dwarfed even the bloodshed of Okinawa. The Navy's command understood that their control of the seas offered leverage not just for military success, but for shaping how, and at what cost, the war might finally end. Strategic planning increasingly reflected this grim calculus. Naval leaders evaluated how continued blockade, bombardment, and air operations could force a conclusion without immediate land invasion. Every decision balanced urgency against human cost, knowing that delay meant continued suffering on all sides. But haste could unleash unprecedented carnage. The Navy's role evolved from battlefield dominance to strategic stewardship, wielding its power to influence outcomes far beyond tactical engagements. By this stage, the Pacific War had been fundamentally decided by maritime control. Japan's advance had been reversed, its defenses isolated, and its options reduced to stark alternatives. The U.S. Navy stood at the center of this transformation, having turned the vast Pacific into an arena of sustained pressure and strategic inevitability. What remained was not the question of whether Japan could be defeated, but how the final chapter would be written, and how the immense power assembled at sea would be used to bring the conflict to its long-awaited end. As the war approached its final reckoning, the U.S. Navy stood poised as both instrument and arbiter of overwhelming power. The Pacific, once contested island by island, had become an uncontested highway for American fleets. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers operated with near-total freedom, projecting force wherever required. This dominance was not merely tactical, it was psychological and strategic, shaping decisions at the highest levels of Allied leadership. The Navy's success had transformed the nature of the conflict, making the question of Japan's defeat a matter of timing and method rather than possibility. Naval bombardment of the Japanese home islands intensified, serving as a visible demonstration of maritime supremacy. Battleships closed to coastal ranges, unleashing heavy shells against industrial sites, rail yards, and military facilities. These operations were conducted with calculated precision, balancing destruction with strategic intent. Each bombardment reinforced the message that no defensive line remained intact, that the seas no longer shielded the homeland. For the crews involved, the missions carried a sobering weight, as the targets now lay not on distant islands, but on the very soil Japan had sworn to defend at all costs. Carrier aviation continued its relentless operations, striking remaining airfields and naval bases to ensure Japan could not regroup. Pilots faced diminishing but still dangerous resistance, flying through flak and unpredictable weather to hit targets already strained by years of war. The emphasis shifted toward denial, preventing recovery rather than seeking decisive battle. Every destroyed runway and fuel depot narrowed Japan's options further, reinforcing the Navy's role as the primary enforcer of strategic paralysis. The air-sea partnership reached its most refined expression, each element amplifying the other's effectiveness. Submarine patrols maintained their grip on Japan's coastal waters, completing the isolation that surface forces and air power had imposed. These boats hunted anything that moved, from small cargo vessels to military transports attempting desperate relocations. The collapse of maritime traffic had cascading effects. Food shortages worsened, industrial output declined, and military coordination fractured. Submariners, long accustomed to operating in secrecy, understood that their efforts were now shaping the fate of an entire nation. Their quiet patrols ensured that no relief, external or internal, could alter Japan's trajectory. Within the Allied command, strategic discussions grew increasingly grave. Plans for a full-scale invasion of Japan remained on the table, supported by the Navy's unmatched ability to transport, supply, and protect vast armies. Yet casualty estimates haunted every calculation, informed by the brutal lessons of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Naval leaders recognized that their control of the seas provided leverage beyond invasion alone, offering alternatives rooted in continued blockade and bombardment. The Navy's power thus became a means not just of destruction, but of strategic choice at a moment when history balanced on a knife's edge. For sailors at sea, the closing months carried an emotional complexity unlike any earlier phase. The certainty of victory coexisted with fatigue, loss, and a profound awareness of what might still come. Ships bore the scars of kamikaze strikes and relentless operations, their crews seasoned by years of combat. Conversations turned increasingly toward home, toward lives interrupted and futures deferred. Yet discipline remained absolute, as every man understood that a single lapse could still prove fatal in a war that refused to end quietly. Japan's remaining resistance, though fragmented, was marked by defiance rather than coherence. Isolated attacks and symbolic gestures sought to preserve honor in the face of inevitable defeat. The U.S. Navy confronted these actions with methodical restraint, neutralizing threats without granting them strategic significance. This measured response reflected confidence born of dominance. There was no need for reckless engagement when time and pressure favored the Allies so decisively. The Pacific had become a controlled environment, shaped entirely by American naval power. By this stage, the Navy had achieved something unprecedented in modern warfare: absolute command of an entire ocean. Japan's advance had been reversed, dismantled, and rendered irrelevant through sustained maritime strategy. The fleet now stood as the final barrier between continued global conflict and the possibility of peace. What remained was the closing act, shaped by decisions that would echo far beyond the Pacific. The U.S. Navy, having broken Japan's advance, now held the responsibility of bringing the war to its irreversible conclusion. The final moments of the Pacific War unfolded not with a single clash of fleets, but with the quiet weight of inevitability pressing down upon an exhausted enemy. The U.S. Navy, having mastered the vast distances of the Pacific, now embodied the cumulative force of years of strategy, sacrifice, and adaptation. Its ships ringed Japan's waters, its aircraft dominated the skies, and its submarines ensured that isolation was complete. What had once been a desperate struggle to survive after Pearl Harbor had become a demonstration of total maritime control, achieved through patience, innovation, and relentless pressure rather than one decisive blow alone. Japan's leaders faced the inescapable reality that the sea no longer offered protection or possibility. Ports lay shattered, shipping was nearly non-existent, and fuel reserves were critically low. The Navy's blockade had turned geography itself into a weapon, exploiting Japan's dependence on maritime supply. Even without further major engagements, the nation's ability to sustain war had collapsed. This outcome reflected a strategic truth the U.S. Navy had learned through hard experience. Control of the sea could determine the fate of nations without requiring constant battle. For American sailors, the war's end carried a complex mixture of relief, grief, and reflection. Many had served across multiple campaigns, witnessing the transformation of raw recruits into seasoned veterans and experimental tactics into refined doctrine. They remembered the early defeats, the uncertainty of Midway, the brutal attrition of Guadalcanal, and the costly triumphs of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Each memory underscored how far the Navy had come, and how profoundly the experience of war had reshaped those who fought it. Victory, though welcome, was tempered by the absence of those who would never return home. Strategically, the Pacific War stood as a case study in adaptive warfare. The U.S. Navy learned to fight an enemy skilled in surprise and aggressive expansion, countering it with intelligence, industrial capacity, and operational flexibility. Carrier warfare replaced battleship doctrine, submarines emerged as decisive economic weapons, and logistics became the backbone of sustained power projection. These lessons were not abstract theories but hard-won insights forged under fire, shaping naval thinking for generations to come. The breaking of Japan's advance was as much an intellectual victory as a material one. The human dimension of this achievement remained central. Behind every successful operation were sailors standing watch through endless nights, pilots launching into hostile skies, and crews repairing damaged ships under threat of renewed attack. Their endurance transformed strategy into reality. The Navy's strength lay not only in steel and technology, but in the collective discipline and resilience of individuals who understood the stakes and bore the burden of carrying the war across an ocean. Their experience defined the character of American naval power at its most demanding hour. As peace emerged from the ruins of conflict, the Pacific itself seemed altered by what had occurred upon its waters. Once a vast barrier separating continents, it had become a conduit for power, cooperation, and consequence. The U.S. Navy's campaign reshaped global perceptions of maritime warfare, demonstrating that command of the sea could decide conflicts spanning half the world. The war left behind new realities, new alliances, and new responsibilities, all rooted in the lessons learned during those years of relentless struggle. The end of the conflict did not diminish the significance of the journey that led there. Each island secured, each convoy protected, and each enemy advance broken contributed to an outcome greater than any single battle. The Navy's success was cumulative, built on adaptation after failure and resolve after loss. It was a reminder that victory in modern war rarely arrives suddenly, but emerges from sustained effort guided by clear purpose and informed strategy. In breaking Japan's advance, the U.S. Navy did more than win a war in the Pacific. It redefined the balance of global power and the meaning of maritime dominance. The ocean that once carried invasion fleets now bore the weight of peace enforced by hard-earned control. The legacy of that campaign endures as a testament to strategy, sacrifice, and the enduring truth that mastery of the sea can shape the destiny of nations.